Welcome aboard, everybody. Welcome to the Yosemite Sugar Pine Railroad. Sure glad everybody is joining us today. Also wanted to say real quick, Happy Mother's Day to all the moms on board. Thank you for putting up with your kids this long. So logging operations actually started up here in about 1874, with the longest running doing steam-powered logging operations would be Westside Lumber until 1960. The Madera Sugar Pine operation was in operation up here until about 1931. The equipment you see off to the left of the train, including the cars and the engine pulling this, are all original equipment. We did purchase it from Westside Lumber when they went out of business. As we're looking off to the left, though, you'll notice that some of the equipment has been burned. The trees have been burned and knocked down. In August of 2017, we had a fire come through here called the Railroad Fire. It did start across the street from our station, no fault of our own. But it did burn about 12,000 acres. It came through our area and burned some of our equipment, but nothing critical. But you can see most of the damage across the valley. You can see all those dead trees over there. It is the result of the 12,000 acre burn. And then in January of 2021, we had a mono windstorm event, which blew for about 6 hours from 60 to 150 mile-an-hour winds, knocking over thousands of trees. Our track crew actually had to clear more than 60 trees to get us back into operation. Also, if you're able to look across the valley at the top of the other mountain, you'll see some trees that are way taller than all of the others. That is an elder grove of redwoods. Behind us, about 3 miles, you'll see a large mountain. That's Mount Raymond. It sits at 8,500 feet. And believe it or not, the railroad went all the way up to that mountain. We wouldn't be much of a logging train if I didn't talk about the trees. We have 5 predominant species up here. The first being the California black oak. California black oak has a maple-like leaf. It's not a thorny one that you would normally see on most oaks. That's one of the few trees up here that actually wasn't cut down for lumber, but it was cut down for firewood, predominantly to power the steam equipment and to heat homes. The local Native Americans, including the Miwoks, would use the acorns. They would grind them up into a powder and soak out the bitter tannic acids. And then they had a flour that they can use for cakes and cookies. The next species of tree we're going to be passing is going to be the incense cedar. The incense cedar is prized for its anti-bug and anti-rot properties. It does smell really good and retains its smell for a very long time. Chances are good some of you here actually have a box that you keep your clothes in, or a closet made out of incense cedar. Another species of tree that we're about to pass is going to be the white fir. The white fir is similar to the red fir, except the red fir grows up at higher altitudes. The white fir has long horizontal branches with lots and lots of needles on every single branch. You'll know that is the common Christmas tree. We're about to enter Horseshoe Curve. Horseshoe Curve was dug out in 1908 by a Chinese labor force just using picks and shovels. They then loaded all the dirt and rocks onto wheelbarrows and carts and dumped it off to the left side of the track. Those oddly shaped mounds that you see over there on the left are the original mounds from the dig out. They're hard to see because of all the vegetation growth. However, we do have a really amazing picture that was taken in the early 30s or late 20s actually, in our gift shop showing this entire area barren and a logging train running through it. As we continue down this way, we're passing some ponderosa pines. The ponderosa pine is an orange scale-like bark. When you do cut it, it tends to smell like butterscotch or vanilla. Trust me, it does not taste like butterscotch or vanilla, but it is prized for its straight grain and lack of knots. Its needles grow very, very long in clusters of 3s. And of course, we wouldn't be the sugar pine operation if we didn't talk about the sugar pines. The sugar pine trees are the largest of all pine trees in the world, with the largest having been found in 2015 in Yosemite National Park. It currently stands at 273 feet tall, 9 inches, and has over a 12-foot base. The sugar pine trees also grow the largest pine cones in the world. They can grow upwards of 24 inches and can be upwards of 4 pounds when full of sap. They're very easily identifiable because the pine cones grow to the very, very ends of the branches. When the logging operation was happening up here by the Madera Sugar Pine, they managed to clear cut over 30,000 acres of forest. They did not believe in reseeding of the forest as they were cutting everything down, so the result you are seeing around you is natural regrowth. Everything around you is under 120 years old. When the logging operation was in full swing, all of the trees up here were the gigantic ones that were the 10 to 12 foot diameter bases and over 100 feet tall. If you've been to Mariposa Grove or Sequoia, you'll know just how big these trees can get. I'm currently riding on narrow gauge rails. Standard gauge is 56.5 inches rail to rail. Our tracks are 36 inches from rail to rail. Anything under the 56.5 inch mark is considered narrow gauge. The logging operations preferred to run narrow gauge track because they had to do less clear cutting of the forest, and the trains can take much tighter turns. Madera Sugar Pine Mill was actually about 3.5 miles down the valley below us, and all the tracks came off of it like spokes on a wheel. Went off in every single direction where there was viable lumber. When they ran out of wood to cut in that one area, they would literally pick up the tracks and move it to a new area. The number 10 locomotive that is pulling us right now is the largest narrow gauge shay ever made. She's capable of pulling 4,300 tons, or the equivalent of 717 full-size T-Rex dinosaurs. The Shay locomotive was designed by Ephraim Shay. Ephraim Shay originally lived in Michigan, and then at that time he was actually a school teacher. After he was done being a school teacher, he went into the Civil War. When he got out of the Civil War, he became a logger. He first started in Ohio, then moved back to Michigan. When Ephraim was doing his logging operations, the only time they could actually move these gigantic trees was during the winter on a sled pulled by oxen. There were steam locomotives at the time, but they were all your standard piston-driven locomotives, not the Shay design. And his original wooden tracks were breaking every time the piston would jug. So he started to come up with a different design. At first, he started with a skeleton car, very similar to the log cars that are at the back of the train. He put a flat bed on the top of it, then put a single boiler and ran a chain from that boiler to the back drive. Eventually, it became the Shay locomotive that is pulling us today. The Shay locomotive is very unique. It is not a standard piston drive. It has 3 side-mounted pistons that go downwards to a drivetrain that powers pinion gears, making the locomotive a 12-wheel drive train. The Shay locomotive design was sold to Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. Lima managed to produce about 2,500 Shay locomotives. On the west coast of the United States, there are only 5 still running. We have 2, the number 10 and the number 15. Roaring Camp has 2 of them, and then there's one up in Northern California that they say that works, but really doesn't. All of the rest of the shays are pretty much in museums at this point. The road bed that we're riding on, not the tracks were laid down by our company, but this road bed that we're on is an original road bed that was in use from 1908 to 1924. If you see the road bed that's down below us on the right, that was also a road bed that was used up until 1931. It is now a forest access road. While you're up here in the Sierra, most forest access roads were most likely train tracks for the logging operations. Here at the Yosemite Sugar Pine Railraod, we do follow all the same rules and standards and procedures of the Southern Pacific Railroad, including signaling when we get to crossings and on blind turns. I'm only saying this because we're about to get to a road crossing where the train will signal. However, the loggers at the time had a different name for it. They called it mountain misery. It does produce an oil that they had to walk through every single day, and it does smell really bad. It takes a lot of washes to remove the smell out of your clothing as well. However, the natives would actually take the leaves and they would make a tea-like drink when they had headaches, body aches, and pains, and they would drink that. Nowadays, we know that the leaves have a very high content of acetylsalic acid, which is the main ingredient in aspirin. In another couple of weeks, these plants will produce a small daisy-like flower, and the entire mountainside will be covered in them. As we come around the turn on the right side of the train, you'll notice a maroon-colored shrub. That's called the manzanita. That's Spanish for little apple. It does produce a very tasty berry towards the end of the year. It does actually kind of taste like apple. The Native Americans would also use those berries for a cider drink, sometimes incorporating the bear clover when they had stomach aches and pains. But now it's pretty much a food source only for the mule deer and the California black bear when other food sources are scarce. If there are any woodworkers on board the train, yes, the inside is the same color as the outside. It does make really great wood products, including dog toys, because it is completely non-toxic. There were many logging operations happening up here over the last 100 years. Especially in the early 1900s, but the Madera Sugar Pine operation was by far the largest. At their peak, they employed over 800 men. Those men worked 6 days a week, were only off on Sundays. They worked 10 to 12-hour days. Very, very hard work. The unskilled labor made 10 cents an hour. The skilled labor made 30 cents an hour, about a nickel more than I make right now. And the loggers got paid by the tree. Every single morning they would set out with their double-bitted axes and crosscut saws they called misery whips, and they would cut down as much viable lumber as they possibly could. Now keep in mind, the trees at that time were the gigantic monoliths that I was talking about earlier, sometimes 100 to 200 feet tall, 10 feet in diameter, and you're probably wondering how they got them onto the flatbed cars. Well, they used a steam-powered engine called a donkey hoist or a donkey winch. No, there were no donkeys involved, but it was a winch-like device that they would use to pull the logs up onto the flatbed cars. Once the logs were on, they would then chain them down, sometimes 30 to 40 cars long, and then take it down to the sugar pine mill that was 3.5 miles down below us. Once the logs arrived at the mill, then they would take them off of the cars and dump them into a log pond, and then they would get rough cut instead of the same kind of lumber you'd find in a hardware store. They just needed to get it into boards that they could transport. Once transported, they would take them down to Madera, 54 miles away, where they would do all of the finish cutting. And then they would be shipped out via Southern Pacific Railroad for local and worldwide distribution. The original journey took about 2.5 days via car. The roads were horrible, so they needed a better way of doing it. They invented the log flume. The log flume is a V-shaped trough filled with water, about 5 feet wide, 3 feet deep. They would bubble the boards together and just send them down the flume, cutting the trip down to just 12 hours. When they built the flume, it cost them approximately $400,000. And in today's adjusted for inflation, that would be about $14.1 million. It was the largest wooden structure in the world when it was built. It stretched the entire length of the 54 miles. And of course, with the invention of the log flume came the invention of a new job called the flume herder. The flume herder's job was to stand on a board about a foot wide and make sure that the flume was freely flowing. We are making an unscheduled stop. Please remain seated. So back on talking about the flume herders. Back on talking about the flume herders. The flume herders had a very difficult job. Sometimes more dangerous than being a lumberjack. They would be off the ground 40 to 100 feet in the air. They did live independently in their own little cabins along the side of the flume. The workers from the Madera Sugar Pine Mill would occasionally fashion a crew raft out of the lumber that was there that they would ride down, sometimes reaching 50 miles an hour. The workers would actually bring the flume herders their food and their mail, sometimes just tossing it into their cabins as they pass by. Yeah, I guess you could consider that the original Uber Eats. We are now at the lowest point on our journey. We're approximately 500 feet down into the valley. That's the equivalent of about a 50-story building. Lewis Creek Canyon is named after Lewis Creek, which is to the right of us right now. It is very hard to see through all the vegetation. But when we get up to our loop, and we're going to be stopping up there for about 5 to 10 minutes, you guys to stretch, you get a very close look at it. When we do stop down, or when we stop at our loop, we do have bathrooms, tables, and trash cans. Feel free to use any of them. If you do see an outhouse that looks like it was built in 1925, don't use it. Just use the porta potties instead. You will thank you later. In a second, we're going to be making a left turn and starting a 9% grade climb. That is 9 feet up for every 100 feet traveled. If you think that is steep, you would be very correct. Most modern locomotives cannot make that grade even without a load. This is what set the Shea locomotives apart from everything else and made them perfect for logging operations. The Shea locomotive is perfectly capable of probably hauling about another 40 fully loaded cars on this grade. We're now starting our climb. I know I said it's illegal to smoke in the forest, but the 10 has the only exception. Also, we do have a full train, so I am asking everybody when we return to please return to the same seats that you came from. Also, if you're desperate for Wi-Fi to check that temper account, you can always walk off into the trees and log on. Please remain seated until we come to a full stop. Wait for it. Alrighty, everybody feel free to wander around the woods.